Can everybody hear me okay? I don't really like these kind of mics, but I can switch to it if that's preferable. Are we good on volume? Fine? Cool. All right. Well, as you can see, my name's Dylan Sheffer, and I really enjoy user experience, front end. Accessibility is kind of my forte. And my talk today is accessibility isn't inaccessible. I was telling some people it's kind of a working title. I'm not sure if I'm in love with it. The idea of my talk, however, is I think that a lot of people are intimidated by the idea of accessibility. And I want to reassure them that it's not necessarily a difficult subject. It just requires a different way of approaching design problems and programming problems. So an overview of my talk is, first I'm going to talk about what it is, why it's important, then I'm going to give some foundational knowledge, and then I'm going to briefly talk about how assistive tech interprets our websites that we build. So first, what is accessibility? In my mind, it's just making our websites usable by anybody regardless of ability. So that has a lot of benefits outside of just being inclusive. There's the increase of customer pool. So think baby boomers. Baby boomers, as people get older, we lose our eyesight, things don't work the way that we're used to, and maybe we need some assistive tech to work with that. If we're developing inclusive experiences, then we're capturing that entire gamut of people that would be wanting to use our websites. There's also the benefit of not having lawsuits. That is a big thing. 508 compliance with the American Disability Act is a very real thing. And lawsuits have gone up tremendously in the past 5 years. I want to say around 30%, but I don't have an actual statistic on hand at the moment. And then my final reason why, besides being inclusive and generally doing the right thing, accessibility leads to better user experience. A lot of general accessibility problems stem from design problems from the very foundation. So by just making things inclusive, we're creating a better experience overall for everybody. Think like if you have been on a website and the text is very small and you're having a hard time reading it, just bumping it up to 16-point font is good for not only people who are hard of seeing, but it's also great for people who have average eyesight and we're just trying to read things quickly. So, as I said before, accessibility isn't necessarily difficult, it just requires a different way of thinking. And that different way of thinking, I've kind of boiled it down to 3 pillars. And that's going to be awareness, we got context, and empathy. So this is going to be awareness of the different disabilities that are out in the world. This is going to be awareness of the technology people are using to interact with our website, and the awareness of just our general tools that we have as developers that we can have access to. Because there is a lot of really cool stuff going out into the world right now. And it's kind of like testing. There's not really an excuse to not do it. There's so many resources out there and it's so important and it leads to such a great result and return on investment. Context is a very important thing. If we're developing something and we don't know what we're trying to convey, then our end result is going to be very ambiguous, and we're not going to be convincing our users on what we're trying to accomplish. Say we are just putting a giant image in the middle of the website, and we're not sure what to do with an alt text, what an alternative text. What do we put it here? Do we just describe exactly what's going on? Is it just a logo? Or is it actually conveying information that the end user needs to understand the context of what's going on in the website? Another example would be if we have an X on a close, like a modal close. If we just have an image of an X and all we have is just an image tag, no alt text, that doesn't show any sort of context on what kind of behavior is going to be associated with that particular element on the page. And finally, there's empathy. So the ability of putting ourselves in one's shoes to understand their situation, their walks of life, how they approach problems, is going to return huge dividends in our future goals as developers and designers, because we're going to be able to understand where people come from, what they want, what their needs are, and we'll be able to create more tailored experiences that are delightful for everybody, regardless of ability. So before I get too far into the talk, it's critical that we get this right as developers. Accessibility isn't really something that we can just put off into the corner and hope for the best. It's our shared responsibility as developers that we get this right. We're all here ensuring the preservation of a fundamental human right of the access of information and self-expression online. And as this infrastructure becomes more and more critical to everybody's day-to-day lives, it's our shared responsibility to make sure that it's inclusive and usable by everybody. Thank you. And if you're not necessarily motivated by altruism, remember that everybody here is just a serious accident away, or just a few years of age away from needing to use assistive technology. And wouldn't it be better if we all put in the work today to make sure that our experiences are inclusive so that we can all have the same quality of life going forward? So, it's a little comedic reset. I just want to remind people of like their mortality. I like to reset the stage a bit. Did anybody see Guy at his restaurant today? No appearances? Oh, nice. Luckily, you don't have to eat noodles in reverse. All right, so this is the WCAG. Has anybody else heard of the WCAG? Maurice? Yeah, cool. The WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's the official guidelines put out by the W3C, the same consortium that's making the standards for like ECMAScript, HTML, all that jazz. It's the official guidelines on, official international guidelines that most people use to standardize accessibility. But because it's technical guidelines, it's very dense and it's really hard to understand, and it's a lot of people's first experience with accessibility. And I think the WCAG, as great as it is, it's one of the reasons why people are kind of turned off from it, because it sounds really complicated. Luckily, the people at WebAIM have gone through and they've created their own checklist based off the WCAG that simplifies it and makes it much more digestible and easier to understand. So if you're in a position where you're like, I need to figure out how to fix, like a Section 2.3c compliance issue, I would check WebAIM's checklist first just to make sure that you understand what it's trying to say. And then it'll get you like at least 80% of the way there, if not all the way there. The WCAG on paper sounds really complicated when you're reading it, but its foundational knowledge, or foundation, its principles that it's based off of are pretty simple. So it just means that our sites need to be poor. It's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable meaning that they're able to perceive it through any of their senses, such as sight and hearing. And that's through assistive technology or just regular, analog signals that we can receive through our own organs. There's operable. Can users interact with their website? Can it be used by keyboard? Is it used by mouse? Is the website understandable? Is it clear? Is it lacking of ambiguity? An example would be like if you get like a dialogue confirmation, you click the cancel button on something. And it's like, are you sure you want to cancel? And the options are okay and cancel. And like, what's the correct answer? Can you be more explicit? And then the final of the WCAG's principles is, are our sites robust? Can it be used on a variety of technologies? Can it be accessed through a screen reader? Can it be scaled up with a screen magnifier and not be completely janky? Can we put it into something like a reader mode or a distraction-free mode so that people with like cognitive disabilities aren't distracted by those like dumb banner ads that are just flashing in the corner and taking away from what's actually important on the page? So there are a number of disabilities. There are motor disabilities, visual, auditory, cognitive, neurological, and temporary disabilities. Motor disabilities, generally, I'm going to be listing off more symptoms, not specific disability like titles, because it's easier to think about the actual symptom than it is to think like, okay, like how can I design a website best for like autistic people? Like, because that's a really hard problem because it's so complicated. There's so many facets. So if we think about treating specific symptoms or designing for specific symptoms, then we can make sure that it's inclusive for that entire gamut of symptoms. I couldn't think of a better word for that. So in motor disabilities, there's paralysis, loss of limb, damage of limbs, muscular dystrophy, tremors. And the accessibility principle to focus on when we're thinking of how can we make this inclusive for motor disabilities is it operable? When we're designing websites, we should like really think like, okay, like is this navigation going to be accessible? These links are really small and they're really close together. Somebody who has tremors might have a really hard time with the fine motor skills to get to that very exact little tiny pixel that you have to click on the correct link. And they could just click on the wrong thing. They could click on a delete button instead of a save button. And the entire user experience is ruined. So by just adding a little bit of padding around your button, then you've just saved somebody an entire 10 minutes of refilling out your form again. So some assistive tech that people with motor disabilities can use. Some of the more obvious ones I would say are like the mouth stick and like eye tracking and trackballs. But sip and puffs are really neat as well, where you can just use your neck and your mouth to control a website. So you have like a stick that essentially sticks out, and it's a joystick. And you can use your neck and your head to move around and operate the joystick, and that'll move around the cursor on your website. And then you can puff, like, you know, puff, and that'll act as your regular click. And then you can sip or suck, and that'll act as your right click. And you can do everything you normally can do on a computer with just your mouth. Another not as obvious one is the single action switch. That is a single click. Like it's only one button or two buttons, depending on the kind that you're using. But essentially, the website will just go down through every single actionable thing on your page, and then when it's the thing that you're wanting is highlighted, you click the single action switch. Or if you know that double tap will bring up a certain menu and you can navigate your page by headers or whatever. The most famous switch user was Stephen Hawking. So if you're ever curious how Stephen Hawking was able to use a computer, but only could really like control like his mouth, or was it his, I forget how he operated his switch. But yeah, he was using a switch device. Before I continue, do we have any questions? A lot of the most valuable feedback I get is just people curious about things and yelling stuff out. No? Oh, yeah. A lot of it is available on the WCAG site. The WebAIM is also very helpful. The one that I linked a couple slides ago, it's going to take a while to get back. But I'll also post this slide, or these slides on the 757 Dev Slack. So if we're all on that, I'll just post a link to it. It's just on the website. I have a slide at the very end that has a ton of information and resources that'll definitely be able to get you started. Awesome. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of, like if you're on a Mac, there's the VoiceOver screen reader. So if you're ever just curious, like, okay, what is the screen reader gonna say when you're running over this? You can use a lot of those free ones. There's Chrome Vox that's built into your browser or as a browser extension. But then there's even like simulators for like color deficiencies. So you're like, the color deficiency names are so complicated. I can't remember what they're called off, like Tsunomia or something. But you can simulate the different color deficiencies and see like, oh, is contrast still going to be a problem with these types of disabilities? It is a huge number. It depends on how you're wanting to frame the sample size, but it's depending on how you're wanting to sample it and what you consider a disability, it can be between 10 and 30% of the population. But yeah. So there's visual disabilities. That includes things like eye-shaped deformities, blindness, low vision, color deficiencies. Eye-shaped deformities are the most common thing, and that's why people need glasses. So Glasses are probably the most common assistive technology out there. It's just a neat way of looking at the world. So accessibility principles to focus on, we're going to have to think about the whole gamut here. Can people who are low vision or no vision perceive what we're doing? Can they perceive the layout? Are we basing pure things off of color? So if we have like a green background and we're using like a red alert, I don't know why you'd want to do that, but if we are doing that, you have to think about color deficiencies and that contrast problem. Like, can we even tell that anything has changed if we have a color deficiency? Also, there's a neat thing to think about with culture as well. When we're thinking about color, red, for example, doesn't mean exactly the same thing from culture to culture. Like in China, red doesn't mean error warning, it means luck. So saying like, oh, this is clearly an error because we made this red. If we're making an international product, that isn't necessarily going to be valid. Then there's also operable. People are going to be able to navigate via keyboard? Are there shortcuts? Are all of the buttons that we have clickable via like spacebar or enter? If we're using a diff, like who has used a diff as a button? No shame, no shame, it happens. Yeah, like if we create custom buttons out of diffs, we have to make sure that we're going through and we're adding all that functionality that a regular button has. Is it focusable if we go and hit tab? Can we execute it with virtual clicks? Like, can we use spacebar, enter? Does it say that it's a button when a screen reader or assistive tech goes over top of it? So there's a lot of things you have to think about if you just veer off of the path of normal accessibility. So my number one suggestion for everybody is just use semantic HTML. It's going to make our lives easier. It's going to make our experiences more inclusive. If we just use what's given to us in the normal spec, it'll get us like 80% of the way there. And then we're only going to run into hard things when we have to create our own custom components. But hopefully we're doing that in sort of like a plug and play kind of way where we can create a general component and just plop it anywhere, like using like React, Vue, Angular, whatever flavor we're feeling like at the moment. So then there's also understandable. How a lot of assistive tech works is it'll take our DOM, it'll take our HTML document and read it from top to bottom. So if we're putting things like our sidebar at the very bottom of the page, then people who are tabbing through aren't going to be able to access that side navigation that seems so obvious to everybody who's looking at it visually until they reach the very bottom of the page. So if you want it to be seen in a specific order, put it higher up into the DOM order. And then you can use something like Flexbox or CSS Grid, and you can rearrange it in any order you feel like it. Modern CSS is awesome. And then robust. Are things going to be able to be used in a variety of contexts? Assistive technology is super expensive. Like, if you need like a Braille reader that you hook into the computer can be like upwards of like $1,500. And some of this tech just can't be updated quickly as like new browser technologies come out. So using really nice progressive enhancement policies on our products will create a lot of the robust challenges that may come up. So there, like I said, there's Braille readers, there's screen enlargers, there's color correcting glasses that people can use, and there's also screen readers that we can use to parse websites. Auditory, there's conductive hearing loss, there's neural hearing loss, high tone hearing loss, low tone hearing loss. The top two generally result in similar symptoms of just not being able to hear and certain, whatever gradient you fall into that area. High tone and low tone hearing loss are kind of interesting, where if you're thinking of like, I'm designing an auditory user interface like a Google Home or Amazon Alexa, by giving like an option for male and female voices, you're being more inclusive because some people just can't understand male voices or some people can't hear female voices because of certain high or low tone hearing loss that they may have. And then, the accessibility principle to focus on for auditory is perceivable, because of course you can't necessarily hear auditory content. Ways to combat that is through captions, FM transmitters, receivers, which are kind of like microphones that you can speak directly into somebody's ear. I thought that was cool. I never even knew that existed. And then there's hearing aids, and then real-time transcriptions, so people can type out exactly what another person is saying at a conference or whatever. There's cognitive disabilities. Cognitive disabilities are probably the most difficult to design for because they are the widest in content, and it also, some of them are conflicting with one another. I'll get into an example. So there's memory, there's problem solving, there's attention, language comprehension, math comprehension, and visual comprehension. Some places where it could potentially conflict with one another is, say we have somebody who has a language comprehension disability, and we have a user that has a visual comprehension disability, meaning language, like maybe English isn't their first language, or it's like a really difficult word, and above a certain grade level, they're not going to understand it. So visual aids usually help with that. So like if I, were in China and I couldn't read where the bathroom signs were, a little bathroom symbol would be very helpful for me. But some people don't understand symbols as well. So having only symbols is going to be uninclusive for people who would just understand if you just wrote down the word instead. So by providing a lot of different options to be able to accomplish a lot of the common operations on your application is the best way to go about that. Accessibility principles, we got perceivable. You don't want distracting banner ads, like I was saying earlier. Operable. You shouldn't depend on users having to know, like, oh, of course you have to go to like this random link at the bottom of the form to hit save to, in order to accomplish this task. Or like, once you finish this, you have to remember to go back to the About page, and then you can go down to About Our Team to find our address. You should just have the information and the tasks ready for the user on the page, nice and easy to find. And that's another thing where increasing the accessibility of a website will also increase the general usability of the website. And then understandable, like I said, icons, and then robust, it'll be loaded into different reader modes and stuff like that. So there's also neurological disabilities. Neurological disabilities can include things like seizures and vestibular disorders. These are something that we have to be very aware of as developers. So not flashing between high contrast things frequently, that can honestly trigger seizures and have physical effects against people, and that could be very, very dangerous. And then vestibular disorders, if we have like extreme parallax imaging or intense animations that's shooting up at us, that can cause physical discomfort for people, like real dizziness and real nausea, and it can affect people's day-to-day in the physical world, not just the digital world. Oh no, I hit the back button. Then finally, there's temporary disabilities. So temporary disabilities are just things that people may come into contact from day to day. So an example would be if you're a newborn parent and you're not a newborn parent, you're a parent with a newborn and you have a newborn baby in your arm and you're still trying to get work done because you have something to do tomorrow. Now you have one arm that you can operate with, and like how can we be as inclusive as possible for that? Like, yeah. Then there's also, if we're walking and we're reading something inside, we step into the sunlight, and now we can't see anything on our phone because the color contrast was not so great because that designer thought like, oh, great, like, gray on white is an awesome idea. And then finally, like, you can't watch Netflix in class necessarily, so having something like captions makes that an actual doable task. And so how does assistive tech work with our websites? It works through something called the accessibility tree. When the browser looks at our document, it gets our HTML, and it parses two different things. It creates the DOM, which is what we're, as developers, typically working with, and it also produces something called the accessibility tree. So that takes all of our semantic HTML elements, and it will take all of the metadata about those and put it into something that is readable and understandable by assistive tech. And it gets put into things called like attributes on the accessibility tree that includes things like name, state, role, and value. Name you can think of as like what you name something. Like if you say like H1, my site title, the name would be my site title. State would be something like a button. If we have a button, there's a click state and there's like a not click state. Then role role you can think of as like an interface. It's a promise to the end user of that behavior. So if I give like a button, a toggle, a role of toggle, I'm promising that user there's going to be a state of on and off. And then value is kind of like value in an HTML element where like it's just whatever you type in. So you have an input and you type in hello, the value would be hello. So finally, I just want to leave everybody with accessibility isn't necessarily inaccessible. It's not super difficult. It just requires a different way of thinking. And that different way of thinking just requires awareness, context, and empathy. Thank you.